I'm the director of the UC Davis Humanities Institute. Thank you all for coming to this event tonight, which is part of our conversation series. Before we actually get rolling, I'd like to give a special thanks to the DHI staff, including Gina and Kathy, Gina Nunes, Kathy Wallerstein, who are here, as well as Elliot Pollard, who helped organize tonight's event. The UC Davis Humanities Institute is the leading voice on campus for the essential value of the arts and humanities. Part of our mission is to underscore how the humanities and arts can be part of, we think, important debates and controversies in the broader society. And it's hard to think of more relevant topics than those we've pulled together this fall for a series of events before the election. The series within the conversation, under the conversation rubric, is called Democracy in Crisis, Democracy and Movements. And it's a series that looks at contemporary crises in democracy globally and at social justice movements that have thrown new demands at democratic principles and practices. Tonight is actually the first of 3 presentations as part of this series. The other 2, I'll just quickly flag for you. Information can be found on the DHI website. October 22nd, Professor Michael Hart will be interviewed by Kathy Wallerstein, the Associate Director of the DHI, and he'll speak about democratic movements in times of crisis. And then on October 29th, Professor Wendy Brown and Professor James Vernon will be in conversation with each other under a rubric entitled Democracy and
Jamie, we can't hear you.
Human rights look like in the context of U.S. empire. I'd have to say this is a very gratifying, I think, program tonight because it's one of our first projects as part of a reconstituted UC consortium of humanities institutes and centers throughout the whole UC system. Judy is the director of the institute at UCI, and Katherine is at UCLA. So this is part of a push, this is, I guess, a weird silver lining of the pandemic, that we can more easily incorporate our colleagues around the UC system at the DHI. So I'll give short introductions to our speakers, and then I'm going to hand it off to Lisa Maderson, who will say a little bit about the project that produces this work. Lisa Maderson is an associate professor of history at UC Davis and the author of For the Freedom of Her Race, Black Women in Electoral Politics in Illinois, 1877 to 1932 from UNC Press in 2009, and co-editor with Ellen Hartigan O'Connor of the Oxford Handbook of American Women's and Gender History from 2018. Faith Bennett is a doctoral student in the history department at UC Davis, working in the area of US women's and gender history. Katherine Marino is an associate professor of history at UCLA and is the author of Feminism for the Americas, The Making of an International Human Rights Movement from UNC Press in 2019. And Judy Tsu-Chun Wu is a professor of Asian American Studies at UC Irvine and the director of the Irvine Humanities Center. She is the author of Dr. Mom Chung of the Fair-Haired Bastards, The Life of a Wartime Celebrity from UC Press, 2005, and Radicals on the Road, Internationalism, Orientalism, and Feminism during the Vietnam Era from Cornell University Press in 2013. She's the co-editor of Women's America Refocusing the Past, 8th edition, Oxford 2015, and Gendering the Trans-Pacific World, Brill 2017. So with that, I'll hand it off to Lisa to say a little bit about the project from which this work comes and for which we're very excited. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having all of us. We're delighted to have this opportunity to share a little bit about the project. Let me, on behalf of this group and the other members of the project, and who I'll mention, actually, let me mention now the other key players, the main researchers, Judy Wu, Rebecca Jo Plant, Katherine Marino, Ellen Hartigan O'Connor, and myself, and a fantastic team of GSRs who have been working very vigorously over the summer on this project. Faith Bennett, Anna Chapman, Samantha DeVera, Charlotte Hanson-Terry, and Casey Callahan. As many people know, this is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, and there has been a public discussion about the reach of the 19th Amendment, which highlights a long history of exclusionary citizenship. And we came together as a group to bring to this discussion this critical discussion, what does it mean to mark the 19th Amendment in the context of US empire? So that was kind of our larger project and coming together. For many people, it has meant a form of a reminder of colonial subjecthood, and there'll be opportunities for us to talk a little bit more about that. So with that in mind, also, we wanted to bring to the center a history of US empire, the history of women's voting rights, particularly because for so long, US historians did not recognize that the US was an empire. Since the 80s and 90s, it's been a much stronger presentation, but that's more recent. It was previously thought of this US expansion empire as something that was kind of a blip in a longer trajectory of democracy and democracy enhancing history. So we wanted to kind of bring these two trajectories together and explore it from multiple angles. And indeed we have. So what I'd like to do is to ask Faith Bennett to tell us a little bit more about some of the components of the project, and then each of us would like to have an opportunity to also use that as a springboard for thinking a little bit more, or say something more about some of our own research as it relates to this larger project of thinking about voting rights, citizenship, political engagement, inclusion, exclusion in the context of US empire. So with that, Faith, can I hand it over to you so you could fill in some more of the details of this project that we've all been working on so hard.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So the Suffrage Syllabus is a multimedia syllabus that is going to be housed through Alexander Street Press on their website and underneath the Women in Social Movements page as well. The Suffrage Syllabus it's big. It has 4 modules, and each of those modules have a varied amount of sections, but approximately 4. The modules in order, they're more or less in chronological order. So the first module with the principal investigator, Ellen Hartigan O'Connor, focuses on women, the modern nation state, and the age of revolutions. Then we have the module headed by Lisa, the women's voting in the US empire. We have module 3, which is women's grassroots activism against US empire, and module 4, which is US gender, empire, and the presidency. So this lets us explore the varied degrees of citizenship and voting rights and how electoral politics looks across the United States and across the US territorial empire. And it's really interactive. We are looking at a website that will allow users to not only see just a selection of incredibly well-vetted readings and a curation of readings that fit into these individual modules and sections within them, but also have summaries for each reading. This is really important, I think, in terms of accessibility, because I've been a museum employee, I've been a community college student, and I've also just been a person who liked history and didn't belong to a university that had institutional access to stables such as JSTOR or a university library. And when you're in a position like this, if you find a reading that you think you want, you go through great lengths to track it down, and then you discover that it's not the right fit for your project, it's very annoying. But since we have these summaries, people are more likely to know exactly what they are looking for and be able to find it. I think that this project also promotes accessibility just in terms of reevaluating what parts of history are part of the story of women's suffrage. If you are Googling things, or even Google Scholar, or looking on your university website or any of these places for stories about universal women's suffrage, for stories about women in the presidency, it's incredibly unlikely that on your own, or even after 2 hours of research, you are going to find a story about women's voting in Guam. And we know this because we had to track these readings down, and some of them were harder to find than others. But because they are all organized within the suffrage syllabus in this way, for future scholars, for future students, and for future teachers, it's going to be much easier to find these readings and to incorporate them into their lesson plans and into their own research about these topics. So I think that it's really remarkable that this is something that is accessible for not just teachers, not just university teachers and university students, but high school students, interested members of the public, etc. And additionally, we have made a few digital humanities projects within the suffrage syllabus. These were crafted by other GSRs on the project. I developed one of them. We have 4 digital projects in here. We have 3 story maps and we have 1 timeline. I worked on the easiest one and it was very difficult to do. It was very difficult to learn how to do it, but the payoff is really big because you can click through something like this and see visually how these stories play out. And there are listicles and YouTube videos abound if you Google women's suffrage and women who ran for president, but none of them have a lot of academic articles and books to recommend that you read afterwards. And so the suffrage syllabus offers something that very few other things do. So it was a really great privilege to be able to work on it and see the type of work that goes into it. And I look forward to being able to share it with the students that are in the section ITA. I look forward to using it in future syllabuses of my own. So now I think, Judy, are you next? No, Katherine? No, Lisa.
Me again. I'll keep it brief since I've already spoken a bit. I wanted to use this as an opportunity to say a little bit more about Module 2 and give an example from my own research about the connection between Module 2, which is about what it means to vote in a US colony. Places like Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, US Virgin Islands. So what does, again, this marking of the centennial of the 19th Amendment look like when you're in one of these US colonies? Before I do, I want to mention that the Module 1 that comes before mine, and Professor Ellen Hartigan O'Connor is not with us today, she looks at the age of revolutions, as Faith mentioned. So it leads up to this kind of prehistory before formal voting rights became a central feature of defining citizenship in modern nation states. But my research, I write about women's involvement in the movement for Puerto Rico's independence. And in particular, I look at their involvement both within electoral politics and outside of electoral politics. Within electoral politics through the Puerto Rican Independence Party, the PIP, which is one of the 3 main political parties in Puerto Rico in the second half of the 20th century, and also beyond electoral politics in the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, which is the revolutionary independence wing of the movement. To the degree that people know something about the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico, they're usually familiar with it because Lolita Lebron, with several other independentistas, went into Congress in 1954 and opened fire, and it received a lot of attention. But there's many things that I could tell you about this history, but the larger point I want to make here, if I as an example of how this fits into the larger syllabus. If we look at the history of something like the Puerto Rican Independence Party, the PIP, one of these electoral parties that is has this long history in Puerto Rico, it allows us to look at the ways that women in a U.S. colony, in this case Puerto Rico, use their very limited voting rights as a form of trying to decolonize, because women in Puerto Rico, historically, they get the vote after the 19th Amendment, but they don't get kind of a full vote. They get only voting rights at the local level. And indeed, along with men, women in Puerto Rico are still ineligible to vote for Congress, a voting member of Congress or a president, and many don't seek to become part of the United States. And so they have operated or organized at the local level. One of the sayings of the PIP is within the regime, against the regime, to use the political rights that they have available to them to attempt to decolonize through the electoral system. So this is just one example of many that appear in the syllabus. And as Faith mentioned, there are others dealing with Guam, dealing with the Philippines, and other sites that provide a different history of women's voting rights or attempts to use voting rights within a US colonial framework. So I just sped through a ton of history, a ton of information, and I can, at a point of a question answer, be happy to say a lot more about the history of women's voting rights in Puerto Rico, the independence movement, and larger sets of goals and so on and so forth. But it gives, I hope, a little bit of a sense of the richness of this history of women's political activism within US colonies that is not necessarily familiar, it's not familiar to many North American audiences, but is central to understanding the history of women's political activism in the United States, in the US empire. So I am going to hand it off to Professor Katherine Marino to tell us a little bit more about her research.
Hi, thank you so much. So I'm Katherine Marino. I teach at UCLA, and it's been really a privilege and a pleasure to be part of this, this consortium and this Suffrage and Empire project. I have been leading module 3, which looks at women's political activism in anti-imperialist contexts that goes beyond electoral rights. So it really foregrounds colonized women and women of color who've had an often fraught relationship with the nation state and with citizenship, which is since they've been denied US citizenship. And so this module looks at how colonized women and US women of color have pursued liberation through transnational and grassroots efforts. So it encompasses Pan-Africanist feminisms, women from the Garvey movement who were prominent not only in the US, but throughout the Caribbean and Central America. We look at global socialist feminisms. And I should say too that our modules move thematically, but they also move largely chronologically, although they also overlap a bit in time. So a lot of the parts of this syllabus are looking at the early 20th century through the late 20th century. But so in the global socialist feminisms, looking at how the years of the 1930s and the Popular Front was a really vital time of women's transnational socialist organizing. And then looking at transnational feminist solidarity and grassroots anti-militarism. And then finally looking at anti-imperialist community activism. And we're looking broadly at empire in the Pacific and also in Puerto Rico. So this connects to my own research in a number of ways. In fact, it also connects to my teaching. I teach a class at UCLA on global socialist, I'm sorry, not global socialist feminism, but on global feminisms. And so a lot of the responses students have had to readings or their ideas have also helped shape some of these readings. I just thought I would share briefly a little PowerPoint that talks about my own work, and my own work looks at feminisms in the US and Latin America. And this is the cover of my recent book, Feminism for the Americas. And this the book looks at inter-American feminism, which was a movement that really started after, in earnest, after US women got the right to vote. But they were collaborating with Latin American feminists and promoting women's suffrage, civil and economic and social rights, as well as human rights. The book really underscores the role that Latin American feminists especially played in a broad definition of feminism that helped shape the notion of international human rights as an interconnected set of rights regardless of race, class, sex, religion, and also looks at the way that Latin American women were actually responsible for pushing women's rights into the UN Charter in 1945 after World War II. This is an image of Berta Lutz from Brazil signing this charter. The US and British women at this conference were actually opposed to including women's rights in the charter because they believed it was either irrelevant or too divisive of an issue to include at that conference. And truly, if it hadn't been for Latin American feminists and the Pan-American movement preceding them by 2 decades, there would be virtually nothing in the UN Charter regarding women's rights. So the book focuses especially on these 6 women from different countries in the Americas. It draws on research that really helped me understand how close their relationships actually were with each other. The lines demonstrate that they talked to each other or that they met each other in conferences. And I really came to focus on personal relationships among these 6, but also broad and beyond them. And realized that often in the face of an Anglo-American sort of imperialist feminism, represented here by Doris Stevens from the US, who kind of claimed leadership over inter-American feminism, often sidelined Latin American feminists, often rejected their attempts to broaden the movement to address anti-imperialism and other issues. Latin American feminists really took the lead. And I found that in the 1930s and 40s, there was a virtual mushrooming of anti-fascist feminist organizations in the Americas that came out of this Popular Front moment that I mentioned before. And this is just a brief list of some of the organizations I found, but they were all connected to each other as well. And so the book really underscores the role of Latin American feminism in promoting this broader vision of feminism, and it has informed a lot of the focus on transnational movement organizing and broader conceptions of citizenship that this module of our syllabus looks at. So I'll turn it over to Judy now, and I'll be sharing.
Thank you so much, Katherine. And Katherine's going to help me because she's going to show my PowerPoint. I'm going to be talking to you today about my research, which is on Patsy Meek. She was the first woman of color congresswoman and was elected from Hawaii. I'm going to talk about her in relation to the syllabus project. So I'm the PI for the last module, and I don't remember if this is our real title or just our joke title, but it's Women Who Ran, Why They Lost, and Why They Won Elsewhere. So we're asking about, or we're examining women, a number of women of color who ran for the highest offices in the nation, the political culture that represented barriers for their electoral success, and then to also think about why women are heads of state in countries elsewhere other than the United States. So Katherine, if you don't mind just advancing to the next slide. I thought before I talk about Patsy Meek specifically, I just share some helpful rubrics for thinking about the issue of equal representation. And if you could go ahead and click on the first. Thank you. And this is from the work of Pam Paxton and Melanie Hughes, who are sociologists, political sociologists. So one question we might ask when we're thinking about women in the vote is, do women have the same political rights as men to participate in politics? And certainly the 19th Amendment has been held up as that moment in which American women gained the right of equal political access. But as we're emphasizing through our different presentations, that's not necessarily true. If you think about women who are in the territories of the United States, we're thinking about racialized women. So for Patsy Meek, her parents are Japanese American. Her grandparents immigrated to the United States. And so for them, they were never able to become US citizens until the early 1950s. So well after 1920. Katherine, if you could go ahead with the next point. So if we think about formal rights, the next question we might think about, well, does equal access to political rights result in equal representation in terms of numbers? If you look at our Congress today, we don't have a female president, but if you look at our Congress, the average is about 25%. So we're far from replicating the demographics in terms of gender demographics in this country, in terms of political representation. And I'm going to be talking in just a minute about the 1977 National Women's Conference. And at the time that Patsy Meek and others were advocating for a National Women's Conference, women represented 4% of the House of Representatives and 0% in the Senate. If you go to the last point, Katherine, on this slide. So the last question we might ask is, are women's interests being advocated for in the political arena? Even if we don't have formal representation, even if we don't have descriptive equality, are women's issues being discussed and are they being authorized and supported? And this raises a host of issues about what's considered women's issues. So if you can go ahead and go on to the next page, and I'll just quickly mention that anthology. You don't have to go back, but this is the anthology in which my essay on Patsy Meek and the 1977 National Women's Conference appears, Suffrage at 100. So check it out. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about Patsy Meek and the ways in which her location in the Pacific, specifically Hawaii, which was a territory when she was born, how that shaped her politics. I love showing this map. So I think for a lot of my students, there's such a different sense of geography. Instead of centering the continental US, to really think about the various islands in which that became part of the United States. And that string of islands, especially in the Pacific, being acquired in the mid to late 19th century, when the US is really embarking on global ambitions and thinking about how the naval ships are going to dock, to refuel, perhaps develop economic relationships. And so those strings of islands become stepping stones of US empire to Asia. Mink grew up in a plantation society. So you see here an image of Japanese American, and I think also most likely Portuguese women who were working in the fields. They were recruited out of the sense of domesticity, that they might be a calming influence on Japanese immigrant men, because they might not be as radical in terms of labor organizing. But these women were hardly stay-at-home moms. They were working in the fields. They worked until they gave birth, and then they had to find ways to take care of their children. And that plantation society, that sense of labor, the recognition of the value of reproductive labor for women, those were things that really deeply impacted Patsy Meek. She went to Congress in the mid-1960s. She left in 1977 and came back again in 1990 and passed away in office in 2002. In fact, when she passed away, first of all, Title IX was renamed after her, so Patsy Meek is the namesake for Title IX. But the other thing that happened is that her constituents re-elected her even after she passed away as an indication of their support of her. And I love this image. I just recently came across it. This is pretty early on in terms of her congressional representation, but this is sort of the practice. When she left for Washington, she had all these leis that were sort of bestowed upon her. And when she's in Washington, especially on the first day or so, these well-wishers are sending the Pacific with her. And I think that really captures the way that she's taking perspectives from a former territory, from the last state, to enter the nation with her. And so I'll just give one example. Here's a button where Patsy Meek is running for presidency in 1972 as an anti-war candidate. But I wanted to give an example of how the Pacific shaped the way she thought about women's politics. So the 1977 National Women's Conference was the US follow-up to the UN conference in 1975. This is a chance for women in the United States to come together to assess what has been done, what needs to be done, and really chart a national agenda for women's politics. There's been much more attention paid to Bella Abzug for initiating and orchestrating this conference, but Mink was actually one of the key supporters that introduced the legislation that resulted in the National Women's Conference. And I want to just highlight three things about what she contributed that showcased where her locale in the Pacific shaped her understanding of women's politics. First of all, she emphasized the importance of the small. So as the organizers trying to think about, well, how do we develop a representative set of delegates to come to the National Women's Conference? And there were about 20,000 people who attended. Not all of them official delegates, some of them just observers. But they came up with a formula. So larger states had more delegates, smaller states had fewer delegates. But she really advocated that even the so-called smaller states needed to have as full representation as possible. So not to assume that there's a political cohesion that exists in the smaller states compared to the larger ones. So she advocated for at least 10 delegates from even the smaller states. And this contrasts with other people who argue, well, maybe we should follow the model of the Senate. Let's have 2 people from the smaller states. I think another aspect of how the Pacific travels with Patsy Meek is that she emphasized the need to have pre-conferences, not just in each state, but also in 6 territories. This is something that she was highly aware of, coming from a former territory in which she really saw herself politically, geologically, ecologically connected to other Pacific islands. She was one of the earliest advocates against nuclear testing in the Pacific. And instead of thinking about Hawaii as in some ways exceptional compared to the Marshallese or to the Bering Islands and the Bering Straits, she really drew the geological and ecological connection between these Pacific islands. And the final thing I'll emphasize about her contribution to the National Women's Conference is that she really wanted to emphasize the importance of history. She wanted each state and territory to really think through what has been the experiences, the leadership of women in those locales. And in fact, I'm looking just this week at the publication that the women in Guam produced as a result of this conference. And they talk about that this was really the first time that they came together to publish something about Guamanian women. The example that Patsy Meek gave when she was testifying for why this conference was so important, she gave the example of Queen Liliuokalani. So she was the last Native Hawaiian monarch in Hawaii who was illegally deposed by the United States, by US military sugar interests in Hawaii. And what I find really interesting about this example is that she goes on to say, well, if you just go a little deeper, you're gonna find similar histories all across the United States, both the territories and the states. And in some ways, this might be sort of a gesture towards a multicultural history of women, right? That there are Native women, there are women of color throughout all these different locations. But I think it's also recognition, excuse me, of the process of settler colonialism, that is a process that was foundational. The deposition of indigenous people, the overthrowing of a female monarch, that in some ways is the basis of the United States. So I'll just stop here and say I'm looking forward to your questions and hearing what you think about what we've been trying to create.
Okay, great. I also wanted to give you all a chance to ask each other questions, although you've been collaborating, I take it. I guess that could be a question too later on, is how the collaboration has worked since you're geographically disparate. But I had a good question from Kathy, and I should say and remind our attendees, if you don't mind posting the questions in the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar, that'd be very helpful. But Kathy asked, what can we learn from the past that can help us in combating current efforts to disenfranchise entire populations of voters? So obviously kind of relating to the contemporary context where we know there's active disenfranchisement going on.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, it's a hard question, and some of my biggest takeaways from this collaboration and my own research, as well for my first book, which is on Black women's political activism in the United States, is that it's a very long game, and you know, there's a constant need to be politically engaged and to, you know, it's not always kind of an upward trajectory, that it can go through cycles. And I think you can see it in the example of the PIP that I talked about and other examples. It's about finding those spaces, even if they don't seem like the most obvious way to attempt to achieve or push back against injustice. And this, you're talking about disfranchisement, or the disfranchising methods that so many people are facing today, and have faced historically in different ways. But it's finding those strategic spaces and using them strategically. So for example, just to go back, just to use the example of the PIP, they don't want to be part of the United States. They don't want to participate in a nation that they see as a colonizing nation, an abusive nation, and one that has put them in any number of unjust situations. But these are the tools that are available to them to try to push forward decolonization. Not everybody agrees that that's the way to do it, but that's one mechanism. Another example that I draw from my own research, or my first book on African American women, is that there's a similar process of what I called proxy voting in my first book, of those people in the case of the first book, of who are part of a community that has an experience with disfranchisement. Those people who can vote, they do so not just on behalf of themselves, but they do so on behalf of other people. So it's also about the strategic use of the vote and approaching the vote, not necessarily as an individual. So, but rather thinking in a broad sense of how one can use the vote to uplift a larger set of circumstances and groups of people who are being systematically disfranchised. So that's kind of a long answer, but it's about being strategic and looking for those spaces to utilize.
I think those are excellent points, Lisa. When I think about someone like Patsy Meek, in the 60s, there were more radical visions of political change that were being advocated for. In fact, there's a great interview between the kind of a third world liberationist activist and Patsy Meek, and that person said, oh, Patsy Meek is so 200% American. She actually believes that electoral politics makes a difference. And I think at this point in US history, electoral politics absolutely will make a difference. It won't completely change or transform the systems of inequality, but it's so apparent that we need to have responsible leadership in our government. Something that really strikes me about the recent call by Donald Trump Jr. To call for this army of people who are going to defend the stealing of the ballot. What's really striking to me is that his father actually controls the state. His father controls the military. He controls the Attorney General office. I mean, they already have control of the state apparatus, and at the same time, they're calling for vigilantism. So I think absolutely we need a social movement that will hold our political officials accountable, and that we need to think about the vote as one instrument among many to create social transformation. I think about, in some ways, the miracle of an all-male body giving women the vote, right? When you are the minority, how do you actually obtain political power? And I think we're still in that situation today. Even if we're not the demographic minority, we're in the political minority, at least right now.
I'll just add too that in addition to those great comments, I have been reading and really appreciating Martha Jones's book Vanguard, which rethinks the history of women's suffrage through Black and political and voting movements through the lens of African American women, and I just think that it's important to remember that in 1920, not only were many colonized women and immigrant women still unable to vote, but African American women in the South obviously still face the poll taxes, the extrajudicial violence and lynchings for trying to attain political power. Learned a lot from Lisa's work as well, just on the fact that African American women really have been at the vanguard of thinking through a politics that not only helps them, but since they are at the intersections of multiple oppressed groups, really ultimately help everyone. And her book really traces this movement from not, the 19th century, but really through the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And so I think that's another way that women's history helps us think broadly about voter disenfranchisement and political strategies to confront that. So recommend that, as well as Lisa's and Judy's works too.
I had a, and then maybe I'll give you guys a chance to ask each other any questions or comment on how the collaboration has worked. But I had a question about the way the syllabus works and how you thought about maybe different levels, because maybe some of the audience teach at different levels in the university, maybe even high school. So that's kind of part A. Part B would be, I'd be very curious to hear about digital resources that you did. I think, Faith, you mentioned some. If you could just describe one or two, just because I'm curious about it myself.
Yeah, so I'll start with the latter question, which I think leads into the first. The digital resources that we put together are ArcGIS story maps and then timeline. And these are digital features that I can't screen share right now, but they are live. They're part of the website and they are embedded into the website and you click through them. The story map is basically a map where the different points on the map have blurbs that expand to tell you more about women's voting in that particular place or the expansion of the Voting Rights Act in that particular place. We have a couple of those, as well as a timeline on women who ran. So you can click through that, and that also, much like the story maps, has pictures, text, links, as well as embedded videos. So these are really great resources that I think are suitable for a high school audience. My family, who might not be interested in everything I do, as well as people who are already operating at a university level with the study of history. And I think that that is one way that the syllabus can be used for folks who may not want to engage with this at a totally scholarly level, who may just want to use this for personal exploration to learn more about women's suffrage and women in US electoral politics and outside of US electoral politics. But I think the size of the syllabus really lets it be, we've often joked that it's somewhat of a choose your own adventure, because you can kind of say like, okay, like I really only want to know about women who ran, or okay, like I really only want to know about how the Voting Rights Act was expanded in the US Southwest. And you can go and see readings in there and pair primary sources with secondary sources. And the summaries are also written on a level that I think is accessible to high school students for sure, and educators for those who may not be in high school yet to share with people who are younger. And because there are also lots of videos and other multimedia links, I think that there's a variety of ways that you can engage with it.
Maybe I'll just say a little bit something about our collaboration. Ellen and Lisa had just finished this fantastic Oxford Handbook of American Women and Gender History a few years back, and I was very privileged to be able to contribute to that. And at the same time, Rebecca Jo Plan and I were starting our editorialship of Women in Social Movement, which is a baby of Tom Devlin and Kitty Sklar. They've been doing this for a long, long time, and they're innovators in digital history before it became more of a prominent trend. So knowing that the four of us were in the UC system and really thinking about the UCs as a university, we were excited by the idea of forming a consortium across our campuses that we can share intellectual ideas. We could involve graduate students so they could receive co-mentorship from each other, but also from the faculty. So I'm trying to think if this is maybe our third year or something like this. But we've had symposia at different campuses. Katherine hosted this fantastic feminist book celebration, I think a couple years ago. And so this is just another outgrowth of that collaboration.
And I would also add to that, that one of the factors that contributed to the collaboration was fully thinking through the way that the UC system has been an engine in women's and gender history, because we had Judy and Rebecca had just taken on WASM. Ellen and I had just finished this handbook, and by coincidence, when we went through not coincidence, but we realized going through the set of authors, the remarkable number of authors who were contributing to the handbook who were the UC system. And we didn't approach it from the perspective of, okay, who's in the UC system. We were trying to think who is the kind of the cutting edge person who can, or we tried to have a generational model to think about the generations of contributions to the field. And when we really sat back and we thought about, and we saw the number of UC authors, and then from our own experiences, I'm a UCLA PhD, the UC system has been an engine for several generations of the field of women's history, and has supported it. And you could see it in the broad spectrum. And so, and now taking on WASM, that this is something that we really need. We want it to lean into and build upon it. So the contributions of the UC system to women's and gender history are deep, and they're profound, and there are faculty across this country who have ties in one way or the other, not necessarily as PhDs, but somehow made their way through the UC system or have a connection. So I just wanted to build as well onto what this was part of our larger conversation of we need to work together, because the ability, the types of things that, you know, Katherine and Judy have brought to the table in our collaboration and conversation are not, it's made me rethink about the way that I think about my research or the questions that I'm asking. And it's just a tremendous, it's a thrill to be able to interact with people who are experts in women and gender in the Pacific world, in Pan-American movement, and to have those conversations that enriches, for me, my research, but I think more generally that can drive the type of research that a world-class institution like the UC system has done and will continue to do. So I wanted to build on that as well.
Right, and there are resources around the system to support these kind of projects, right? Have you guys had support from UCHRI? And yeah, so I mean, people should know about them. Our attendees should know about them as well. Judy, if you wanted to say anything about them.
Yeah, no, the UCHRI is funding the Empire and Suffrage Syllabus project.
Yeah,
I think it was our second application.
Mm-hmm.
We don't like to take no for an answer.
No, that's an important point. I think that people should reapply, because obviously this is great work. The collaborations functioned wonderfully, and shows that people should reapply. Maybe another one or two questions. Did you have any questions for each other?
I do want to briefly mention in terms of UC resources that we took advantage of also, that the tool to use the story maps is something that every graduate student at UC Davis has full access to. And so you are able to use that tool, and it's hard to learn if you're not amazing at computers or the internet from the jump, but once you get there, it's really worth it. And I think that you can see through the other GSR's work in the project how valuable those story maps can be.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, did you want to say a little bit about the upcoming symposia in which we're workshopping the syllabus?
Yes, thank you, Judy, for reminding me of that. So we are at the penultimate draft of the syllabus before we go forward with publishing, and we have leading scholars from around the country who are going to provide us feedback for the final push, and we have two symposium that are open to members of the consortium. If you are, you can be a member of the consortium. It's not an exclusive group, but the first one is on the 20th, and the second one is on the 27th. The first one will be on modules 1 and 2. with Susan, not Gladys Jimenez Munoz, who is one of the leaders, who is the leader in the history of suffrage in Puerto Rico, and with Kathleen Cahill, who also has a fantastic book coming out about women of color in the suffrage movement. And then on the 27th, we have modules 3 and 4, we will be inviting, help me, I don't have my list in front of me, Robin Spencer, Anastasia Kerwood,
Laura Prieto.
Laura Prieto. Yes, and
Leandra Zaro.
yes, thank you. So it'll be we know it will be a rich conversation, and we are eager to get feedback and to think and to hear what kind of connections we're making, not making, we can build upon. So we will start to advertise this momentarily.
Great to hear, and maybe that's a good note on which to end. I don't think we have any more questions in the Q&A window. So, and we're now at 6:02, I see. So the VP debate is just starting. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for this great collaborative project. Thank you to our attendees, and keep up the good work. Be sure to vote, everybody, right? That's one of the messages of tonight. And look forward to seeing you all again soon. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for hosting us and for organizing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Good night.